Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. My name is Ryan Estrada. I am here with my fellow cartoonist, Jose Pimienta, and our presentation today is called Every Step is a Story. What steps are we talking about? We both make comics. And making comics, making graphic novels is a very long process that can take years, from pitching the book to outlining the book. Then you got to write a script. Then you're doing something called thumbnails you'll learn about. That's fun. You're penciling the book. Then you got to ink the book. You got to add colors. You got to add letters. You got to show it to editors. You got to show it to readers. And every single one of those steps is a new chance to add deeper storytelling to the story you're trying to tell.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about balancing words and images, meaning why each step of making a comic matters. So how do you go from your initial idea, like the first thing that comes into your head, or like something that you've been thinking about for a very long time, or the story that you really want to tell? How do you go from there to the final page, to the printed page, to the final comic book, to once it's on the shelves in stores and everything? How does that happen? We're going to be talking about this. So in comics, there is no right or wrong. Rather, there's a lot of options that make the process more accommodating to the storyteller. Yeah. But first, Ryan, would you like to tell us who you are?
Yeah, sure. I am Ryan Estrada. I am an author, artist, adventurer who has made books like Banned Book Club and the follow-up books, No Rules Tonight and Good Old Fashioned Korean Spirit, which those are all true stories about my wife, who was chased by the police for smuggling illegal books across South Korea under a dictator in the 1980s. I have a series called Student Ambassador that's about a little Mexican-American boy who travels the world having adventures. I did the book Occulted, which is a true story of my friend Amy Rose, who used banned books to escape a UFO death cult. I've also worked on things like Garfield comics. I worked on Flash Gordon and Popeye and Star Trek and so many things that I'm excited to talk to you about. And who are you there in the Zoom with me?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jose Pimienta, pronouns they, them. I am a both author and comics illustrator, predominantly illustrator these days. So I write and draw my own comics, but I also love collaborating with other creatives. I've made a number of comics with other creators such as Soupy Leaves Home, The Leg, Stars Hide Your Fire, Luminous Beings, but I also write and draw my own comics, some of them being Suncatcher. I'll mention this a little bit later on. Twin Cities, which is the story of these twins that live in a border town, but then decide to go to different schools on different sides of the Mexican and American border. And Halfway to Somewhere, which is about a Mexican kid who moves from Mexico to Lawrence, Kansas. I've been making comics for a very long time, and I'm just very excited to be here. So when it comes into making a comic, how many steps are there to making a comic? How do you start? Where do ideas come from? Is every step a hard rule? Who wrote these rules? Can I skip a step? And when does it all end? So why don't we start talking about a few things? Can we go to the next slide? So this is just to give you like a general idea of how we go from the concept or from your idea to the cover. This is, for instance, like this is just the beginning and the end, in my opinion. Like on one side, I have Twin Cities, the outline, what my outline looks like. And in the end, you have the cover for the final book.
All right. Well, then why don't I jump in and talk about the first two steps to go from this to that. Pitching and outline. Now, you may not know what those things mean. The pitch is a step where you have to convince someone else to either fund your book or publish your book or your comic. Now, we're talking about you can skip steps. You don't always need that. Sometimes you're just at home and you say, hey, I want to make a comic. Maybe I'll put it on social media. Maybe I'll just show it to my friends. In that case, you don't need a pitch. But say you want someone to publish it, you're going to have to show them a packet. This is my packet here, if we can just zoom into my camera. So the book that I just published last October was called No Rules Tonight. And the pitch looks very different, even a different title called Christmas After Curfew. And this is kind of what the pitch looked like. It just kind of has a little image of some characters, information about the book, information about the characters, and about who the book is for, and some sample ideas of what the pages might look like. Now, this this project changed a lot from this. As I mentioned, the title was different, but the main thing you want to do with a pitch is because you're starting with you're starting from nothing. You need to give your story a hook. You're taking 200 pages and putting it down to a few. So, what is it about your story that's going to grab people? Because what we had with this book is we had a whole lot of different ideas that were kind of left over from our research in our previous book. All these stories that didn't necessarily fit together, all these characters, all these things that happened to them, and I tried to figure out what can I do to connect them. And I realized there's a bit of history that I was fascinated by, that in 1980s Korea there was a curfew that if you're out after midnight you go to jail. But the one exception was Christmas Eve. So it became a totally different holiday in Korea where Christmas Eve was a one night you could do whatever you wanted. So that was what the idea was. What would you do with one night of freedom? So I can very simply tell that story and then get people excited about it. Now, they bought this idea, and the next step is move to an outline where you take this very simple idea and kind of not write the whole script, just break down the various steps of what you're going to do. And so usually I do that with Post-it notes that I put on the wall. Like, let's move this scene here, move this scene here. An example of that is with the follow-up book, Good Old-Fashioned Korean Spirit, where, again, I'm taking a lot of leftover stories that didn't necessarily fit together, but it all takes place on this farm. And then you got to figure out what order to put these different scenes in. And I realized that since the idea was it was considered a haunted farm, what if I structured it like a horror movie, like a slasher film, where we introduce each character, then one by one, each character disappears. Now, in this book, they're disappearing because they got sad or they got scared or they're hiding a secret. But I structured it in such a way that it feels like it would if it were a horror movie. And then that's how I was able to get all my Post-it notes in the right order, and then know when I write the script what I need to sit down and do. How does that match with your process?
For me, it's very fascinating because I kind of work in the reverse of what you just mentioned. So, for instance, I like to do my outline first because that way I kind of figure out what the story I'm going to tell, what the story that I want to tell is going to be, and then I present it to whomever I'm going to pitch it to. So, kind of going back a little bit back to basics, outlining for me looks like it's the beginning of the idea. Like once I have an idea for a story, once I have a concept, I try to bring it into what's, how the story is, what the arc is going to be. Like, where does the story begin? Where is it going to go? And how is it going to end? So I do that in the outlining. That's kind of where I figure out just like, who are these characters going to be, or what are their ideas of what they're going to be. It's very general. Like, again, it's very direct. A lot of my outlining really is just, and then they're hanging out at school, and then a day later they're going out to eat, and then they're going to do this. But again, I start developing a clear idea of what the characters are going to go through, or what the main concept of the story, how is it going to change over the course of the storytelling. And then I put together a pitch deck, or I put together my pitch, which is where I get to exercise a couple of different fun things. I like to do story sketches. So that way they're just sketches of, moments that can happen during the story, whether they end up in the final version or not. I do character sketches, as you saw in one of the previous slides. Like there's some character sketches, there's some environment sketches. Again, it's very general and very rough, but I put it together so that way I can show it to whoever I would like to get this book published. The other thing that I work out in the pitching stage is I try to find what the core idea of the story is going to be, because that way I can develop what is usually referred to as an elevator pitch, meaning the essence of the story being told in one or two sentences. Now, this is very, very difficult, and it takes a lot of practice. So if you would like to exercise this, please practice. But like, for instance, with my book Suncatcher, it's the story of a teenage musician who discovers that her grandfather's soul is trapped in a guitar. And the only way to set him free is by playing the song that he never got to write. That's the pitch. When I was putting it together, there were a lot of sketches, and like there were a lot of character developments. There were a lot of just like different ideas. But again, while I was working on the pitch, I wanted to figure out just like what is like the main point. Um, so, or for instance, with Twin Cities, as I mentioned earlier, these twins live in the border town of Mexicali, Mexico. They graduate sixth grade, and one of them wants to study middle school on the American side, while the other one stays on the Mexican side. The story goes from there. Like that's the pitch. But when I'm putting together a pitch, I also add where is it going to go? What friends are they going to make? And that's all just, again, very broadly figuring out where the story is going to go. And I'm keeping it loose because I just want to figure out like the overall, if that makes sense. So yeah, that is how pitching and outlining works for me. Is just get the general idea, have like a definitive goal, and make sure that the story that you want to tell fits within that scope. Um, Now, I believe that there's an activity next, right, Ryan?
Yeah, why don't we give this a try? We always talk about how, you don't necessarily have to do this. So you can skip steps. Everyone's process is different. But as you can see from our examples, when we put together a pitch and show it to someone, we learn something about our story that we didn't necessarily realize. So I'd like you all to try that. And now, don't you say you don't have an idea. I know you all have an idea. There's something that happened in your life. There's something, maybe you watched a movie and said, oh, I think it'd be better if they did this, or I have an idea to make a story like this. Think of that idea that you really like to make, and I want you to take if now educators, if you want to try this activity, pause the video after we do this, and then I want everyone to take 30 seconds, split into groups of two, and tell your neighbor about your idea. Try to get it down to just, I know you have big ideas. Try to get down to just 30 seconds with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and uh and see if you can make them as excited about your story as you are. If you want to do that activity, pause the video now. All right. Hope you had fun. Let's move on to our next chapter.
Right. So we're going to move on to the next chapter, which is scripting and thumbnailing. Now, this is what most people refer to as the writing part, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So once you know what your story is, once you know what you're going to write, it's time to sit down and write your script. Now, in the presentation that we have several examples of different scripts. If we would like to look through them and just as I talk a little bit here. So writing a script, like again, there's no specific format. There's no, as we mentioned before, there are no set rules. You can try different things. So the idea is just that when you're writing a script, what do you want to figure out in this? For my example, for instance, what I do in a script is that I like to take my outline and I like to start breaking it down into pages, just in the form of text, just in the form of like using words. I break it down into pages so that way I have an idea of how long the book is going to be. And this is also where I like to start figuring out dialogue. This is where I like to figure out like how the character is going to say something, not just what they're going to say, but how are they going to say it? What words are they going to use? And yeah, again, like the scripting that I like to do, that I personally like to use is just page 2. This is going to happen. This is what the characters are going to say. That's enough for me to move on. And my scripting is also it's very visual. And what I mean by that is that I don't really talk a lot about like when I'm scripting, I don't really talk about like what they are feeling or like what they are thinking of, because for me it's important in the script to just be what am I going to draw. So for instance, if we can go to the next slide. This is a very clear example. This, you see this giant page, you see all that text? That is just for one panel in a page with 9 panels. This is something that we might consider overkill, but I think it's a really good example. Okay, again, like if you see what is highlighted in the page, that is what is actually drawn in the actual panel. The rest of it is just the writer is just coming up with ideas. The writer is just describing things. That works for some people. That doesn't work for a lot of people. So in the scripting stage, I like to think of it as just like, what would you like to see in the pitch that you're going to draw just to get the idea out? How does scripting work for you, Ryan?
Yeah, scripting is always different for everyone. There's no right, there's no wrong. Like for example, for me, you mentioned that's when you sit down at the computer and write. For me, writing doesn't happen at the keyboard. Writing happens when I'm riding my bike, when I'm walking up a mountain, when I'm sitting on a bus, and I sit and watch it in my head, and I watch it over and over again until like every time it's a little bit different. And then when I have to like rush to my keyboard and type it, and it's like you've seen a movie a million times, but you have to describe it to someone else because you're the only one that's ever seen it. And so for me, that's the process. And then, as you mentioned, every format is different. Like with movies, there's a very strict rules about how it's formatted. With comics, it's however works for you. And for me, it's always some books I write and draw. Some books I draw for other people, and different artists like me to draw things, write things different ways. Some people like more detail, not as much detail as that Watchmen script you showed, but some people want me to tell them what happens in each panel. And some people say, "Hey, visuals are my department. Don't tell me how I'm drawing it. Just tell me what's going to happen." And so this is a script from Band Book Club, the first book in the series. And I was drawing this for someone else. And as you can see, I went in a lot of detail about how to break down the panels, what's happening, because the person I was working with speaks English as second language. So he wanted as much detail as possible. And then from the script, things change. You don't do just one script, you do multiple different drafts of a script. And so like with Good Old Fashioned Korean Spirit, actually it changed so much that every draft I did had a different main character. I pitched the book, the pitch document. I told you Hyunsuk, the same character as the first book, was the main character, but then they said, "Hey, why don't we try a new character?" So I created a new character named Ashley, Korean American, and wrote a draft with her as the main character. And then they said, "Hey, we prefer this other character that was in the previous book because it kind of ties it together." So I wrote the same book with 3 different main characters. And then once you have a script, you move on to thumbnails. Now, for me, the thumbnail process is that's a process that I skip a lot. When I'm doing something myself, I almost never do. But when I was working with a big publisher and they wanted me to do it, I did this, which is overkill. This is the entire book completely readable, where I did the lettering first and then printed the exact panels as they're going to be. And you can see I have the entire book completely readable with terrible, terrible drawings that no one should ever have to look at but me. And when you're thumbnailing, you're seeing things like, what if I make this panel bigger? What if I make it smaller? How do people feel about the character if I have this expression versus that one? And again, for the book following this, I didn't do this because I put so much detail into how I did it here that I kind of realized that I broke it down into basic order. Like every panel has 3, every page has 3 rows, where this is 3, this is 2, this is 1. And so I figured out I can just, as I write the script, I can write these 3 go on 1 row and this one is 1 row, and I can like visualize it in my head. So I don't have to go into this much detail. But this is the process where you're figuring out how it's breaking. In both of these, you're figuring out how to break it up. And we were talking about like, what do you put on a page? How do you just write and then as soon as nothing fits, you move on to the next one? You have to be very thoughtful about what a page means. Like I always try to think of a page as like a complete thought. There's a reason to begin there and there's a reason to end there. And I think of it as like a paragraph. And when you move on, maybe you're changing locations, you're changing ideas, but sometimes you can carry over if it's for a reason. Like say you want to surprise the audience. When you surprise someone, it's when you make them expect something, but then you get something different. But then if you just set up and then the next page is different, they haven't had time to create an idea in their minds of what's going to happen, so they're not surprised. But if you say something on the last panel of the page and make them think, "Oh, I know what's going to happen next," while they're turning the page, they're thinking about it. And then when they see what happened in reality, they're surprised. So there's a million ways to decide what you're going to put on a page, what's going to happen, what happens in a panel. And that's what happens during this process, where you're just kind of figuring all that out and trying to make your story the best it can be.
in my opinion, as it says right there on the slide, thumbnailing for me is another language for writing. So this is when you turn this is for me is where I turn my script, which is just words, into just pictures. So this is where I really just let the visuals flow. And as I mentioned earlier, like in the scripting space, in the scripting stage, we put down like how the pages are going to break down and just like and what are the characters going to say. But in the thumbnailing, I get to decide how many panels are going to be on the page. What is the flow going to be? How do we go from one panel to the next? Where do I want the page to end? How do I want this? How do I want the page to feel? And also just figuring out like how am I setting up the scene? Like where are the characters going to be standing in relation to each other? So that way, when they're talking, where the word bubbles are going to go. Where in the page is a character going to say something versus what panels are going to be silent. This is all what I figure out in the thumbnailing stage, and much to Ryan's own words, these are just like the doodles and the scribbles and the notes and the messy that it's only important if you can read it. If other people can read it, that's nice too. But the most important part of this stage is that you are figuring out how you want the story to flow. How do you want the story to look? How do you want the story to pace itself? And as long as you understand that, that makes sense. The other reason why I think that thumbnailing is very important is because generally, or for the most part, thumbnails are done as very, very tiny drawings. Like for instance, like the ones in the previous slide, they are like about, yeah, like those are very small. Like those are about like maybe like one, or I think they're like 2 inches by 2.5 or something like that. They're very small. And the reason why it matters to me that way to keep it that small is because I'm trying to solve the storytelling part, which is a way of how to solve the problem of making sure the story is clear. And one of the big lessons that I learned in art school, and that I think it applies to everything, is small problems are easier to solve than big problems. So if I need to figure out how the page is going to look, it is better to do it small instead of trying to solve the problem when I'm drawing like a very big page. And that is part of the thumbnailing. So like, and again, I do this for the entire book in one go. So that way, kind of similar to what Ryan was saying, like by the time that I finish my script and I have the story that I want to tell, then I get to draw the whole book, but in very, 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 very tiny form. So that way, by the end of it, I have the whole book. And now I know how many pages it's going to be. I know how long it's going to be. And I know how it flows in a very, very, very tiny way. So if there's things to solve, if there's still problems that I need to fix, it is easier to do them at this size.
And I'll say that's why is because the version I talked about that I drew the same size of the book actually took me longer than it would have taken to draw the book.
I mean, but again, it doesn't matter how many turns you make, you're going in the same direction, right? So with that in mind, we have another activity that we would like to bring that we would like to include involve you in. So in this activity, we are going to do a very quick three panel story. So educators, please pause the video now and follow these very basic steps. In the pairs that you were in the previous activity, draw 3 panels and then just draw your story with just stick figures. Again, just loose. Keep it loose, keep it quick, and then show it to your partner, see if it's clear, receive feedback, and go from there. So if you would like to give that a try, we highly encourage it.
Now, you've noticed everything we've done up to now is what you could consider pre-production. It's things that you do before you start drawing the book so that you know what to draw and you know what's going to be good. Now, for sometimes if you're working on a big book, this can be a year of the process, everything we've talked about right now, where you haven't even drawn anything yet. And then you start drawing, and that takes a long time too, because we're now going to get into penciling and inking. Now, that's a very simple thing to define. At first, you're just sketching with pencil. I like to use a blue pencil because it's easier to ink on top of. Because if you're drawing using black ink on top of black pencil, it can be hard to see what you're doing. Blue pencil is very easy to draw on top of, and it's very easy to remove digitally. But if you want to see what the book looks like, for me, my next book, Good Old Fashioned Korean Spirit, oh, if I can even lift it, this is what the book looks like. This is a lot of drawings. This is another year of my life. Because I like to draw very large because I'm, you know, these books have a lot of characters. So each page is just a row of 3 panels, and 3 pages, 3 of these drawings come together to make one image. Now we're doing a lot of rewriting here as we go. That you've got these thumbnails where it's quick sketches, but then maybe as you're drawing it, you realize, oh wait, that doesn't necessarily make sense. Like, wait, I had him walking out that way, but the door is that way. How does that make sense? And you're kind of working things out, and then realizing like, oh, I need more room here, or like when you're looking at it, oh, maybe I want the character to feel really lonely here. Is there a way I can redraw it to show more of the loneliness? And so, yeah, you're doing. Here's what the cover looked like. And so, yeah, it's a very, very long process. Some of the pages are like this with a lot of characters in them, and some spiders and such. And so, yeah, this is a time when the thing that people think of when they think about making comics is sitting down and drawing it. But, and again, this is something that is different for everyone. I mentioned using 3 pieces of paper to make 1 page. That's not a normal thing. People don't normally do that. And you see that this is like very sturdy, expensive paper. That is absolutely not necessarily. Some of my previous comics, I drew on whatever scrap paper I could find with like I used to be a teacher, and I would sit there as my students are doing their work and just be doodling, and then realize, oh, I really like this page. I'm going to scan it and put it in my book, and then realize I drew it on the back of a kid's homework. And I have to tell the kid, you can't have your homework back until tomorrow. I need to scan it. So you can use any kind of materials that you want. The reason I did this is on this paper and in this way is because when you're working for a big publisher, you do pencils first and they want to give you feedback. You do the whole book in pencils, they give feedback. So I might draw the pencils and then ink it a year later. So I have to make sure that I can keep all these in order. They don't get torn, they don't get lost. So I got some really nice paper so that I can keep them all in order and not get confused. And I have to label all of them. If you see, there's little numbers on the bottom of every page that tell me what page and what panel they are, and so that I can keep it all together. And yeah, it's a long process, but you get the fun of drawing your book. What about you?
So I want to make a couple of notes. Is that so when we say penciling, we are talking about a very traditional step. So and again, the history of comics is like this long. So if you ever want to look into like the history of how comics came to be what we have them as now, please feel free to do so. It's a wonderful story with a lot of things to be said about. But yeah, so penciling in the traditional sense, and I'm a traditionalist in this way. So I draw my pencils traditionally, similar to Ryan, where I use a mechanical pencil on Bristol board, and I draw them on a 9x12 Bristol board. As you can see on this page, like they're not that loose, but they're relatively loose. Like again, like there's like a lot of underdrawing and figuring out. You don't have to do it this way. Like for instance, like I know a lot of wonderful cartoonists that they draw all their comics digitally, like, and they use whatever software they have. Similar to what Ryan was saying, like you can use the back of scrap paper or you can use your tablet. The term penciling is just like the underdrawing or like getting ready for like preparing the page of how it's going to be. So again, going back to what we've been saying all along is that there's a lot of ways to go about this. This is just the term that we're using. The way that I do it is that I use graphite pencil on a mechanical pencil. And this is usually the stage of writing or of making a comic where I let this is where I get to find out the character's like more defined personality. So, as we mentioned previously, in the scripting is where I figure out the dialogue, in the thumbnailing is kind of where I figure out the staging and the pacing. In the pencils is where I get to figure out how are the characters acting, like what are their facial expressions, what is their body language. Sometimes I will thumbnail a character standing, but then as I'm penciling it and I'm reading the dialogue back and forth, I'm like, I think this would make more sense if they're leaning against the wall or if they're sitting down. So I have to refigure that a little bit. And it's fun because, again, like nothing really has changed, rather just how the character is interacting in the page. And it's so also similar to what Ryan said, like, so these are usually the stages that most people think of making a comic. Like, this is like the part where, like, yeah, you're actually drawing what the final page is going to look like. But again, the more you do it, the more you get to find out that during this stage, you're just figuring things out. You're still keeping it relatively loose, but you are sticking to a goal. Now, the next stage for me is like once I finish penciling the whole book, once I know how the whole book is going to be in pencils, it is easier for me to go into the inking stage. Now, once again, I am also a traditionalist in this sense. Like when I ink my pages, I use brush pens, microns, pit pens. I used to use dipping ink like quills and actual brushes. I don't do that anymore. That's a whole different conversation. But yeah, so the purpose of inking, again, historically speaking, is very fascinating on why we ink comics. But the reason why I like to do it is because it helps me clean it up. I mean, just comparing the previous slide to this one, like look how clean it is. Look how defined it is now. Now to me, it looks like the characters have fully come to life in this sense. Everything is definitive. I've come to find out how much of the background I'm using, when am I using a background. And that is also something to figure out during this stage, or at least this is where I explore, because drawing backgrounds is really fun for me, but sometimes they get in the way. Sometimes they make the page better. Sometimes they make the page too cluttered. Sometimes they make the page more clear. So these are the things to figure out in this stage. So yeah, but again, going back to what I said earlier, like there are no rules for this. For like, so if you're drawing comics digitally, inking is just giving it like the definitive line art, as they call it, and that works too. So give it a go. And yeah, I mean, like similar to once I do the whole book in pencils, then I do the whole book in inks. And this is the stage where for me, I'm just listening to music, listening to podcasts. I'm just going on top of it. Not a whole lot of writing per se tends to feel around this stage because it kind of feels like I'm just going over drawings that I've already figured out. But it is also an opportunity to take into consideration of, is it flowing the right way? Is the page making sense? Do I need to add anything else? Do I need to fix panels? Similar to as mentioned earlier, like do I need to like add a new panel and so on and so forth. So again, through every one of these stages, you're just asking yourself some questions that you want answered of, is the storytelling working? Is it clear? Does it make sense? So I believe that we have another activity after
Yeah,
this.
sure. So yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm sure you guys want to try some drawing. I'll just add in that, like, we always talk about how these steps can be different for everyone. The whole process of doing the whole book in pencil first and then ink, it's part of working in traditional publishing. It used to be that, like people that do monthly comics, they can't draw in pencil and ink the same book because they wouldn't have time to sleep. They wouldn't have time to go to the bathroom. So they have two different people doing it. And then for me, like I love to skip this as much as possible whenever I can, because not I still do pencils, but then I ink it myself without having to wait for someone to look at it.
Right.
Sometimes I cheat and I complete my full comic and then I put a filter over it so it looks like pencils, and I show it to the editor and say it looks good, and I turn off the filter and say I just inked it. Don't tell them. But I would love for you guys to get the chance. So if you want to pause the video and the story you've been talking about your partner with, why don't you draw a picture of your main character? We did the stick figure version. Now take a couple of minutes and just let's try penciling. Get out some pencils and draw a sketch of what you think your main character of your story looks like, whether the character is you, whether it's a monster, whether it's an animal. Draw it and then show it to your partner, and you can discuss what you both drew.
Ryan and I go about this differently, and I want to hear what he has to say. But first, I'm going to tell you how I go about it. So once I've inked the whole page, once I've inked the whole book, I have to scan them on my scanner, which takes about all day because it's a lot of pages. I scan it all. Now the book is not just on paper. Now it's in the computer. And what I do next is that I letter it, meaning I add the dialogues, I add any caption boxes. So that is basically lettering. Like you get to put like the word bubbles in there. I like to do that digitally for a number of reasons. One of them is because one, it's easier for me. Two, it leaves a lot of room for cleaning up mistakes or for fixing up dialogue. Because again, like as you're writing, you're starting to figure out like, oh, the way that this character said this, maybe they can say it shorter, or maybe they can say it with different words. This bubble is interfering with with this back with the background over here, or it's going to be on the character's face, so maybe I need to figure out another way to do it. So I just digitally letter my entire book. Plus, it still looks like a black and white book. But yeah, like this is the stage where I do that, and I do that all in Photoshop or Clip Studio. There are a number of softwares out there to do this. So yeah, so that's that's the next stage that I do, and that way once again I kind of see like, is it working? Do I need to fix anything? But then I go to the next step, which is something that has been a bit of um, a growing thing in my career, which is coloring. So coloring is exactly what it sounds like. You get to add color to to your comics. But also like this is kind of where I want to fly a little bit of the flag that coloring is also writing, because when you're coloring, this is an opportunity that you as the storyteller get to choose what colors you're going to use, and if the colors are going to mean anything, and see how that adds to the story. This, from as simple as, is this at night, or is this in the morning, or is this in the middle of the day, all the way to what is the symbolism of colors. Like for example, in my book Suncatcher, the entire book is done with just like a very limited palette. Like there's only like 5 or 6 colors throughout the entire book. However, the color red is very important, and it only pops out in one place during the entire book. Or for instance, on my book Twin Cities, it's about this border town. It's about these kids living in a border town between Mexico and the U.S. So I use the colors of the flag to add to the storytelling. So whenever we're on the Mexican side following Fernando, there's a lot more, there's a lot more greens and browns and yellows. But when we're on the American side with Teresa, who goes to middle school in the American side, there's a lot more blues. There's a lot more. There's a lot more. There's a lot more vibrant reds and whatnot, because those are part of the American flag. However, when they're in their room together, or when they're in their house together, I'm sorry, which is where their siblings, they live together. There's a lot of pink, because in my mind, pink is what you get out of white and red, which again are the two colors that both flags have in common, and that kind of adds to it. It's not very deliberate. It's subtle, but it adds to the storytelling. And for instance, in Halfway to Somewhere, this is about a Mexican kid that moves to Lawrence, Kansas, and Ave, the main character, they have a huge wardrobe. They wear a lot of different outfits. They wear a lot of different, they wear a lot of different styles. But the one color they never wear is blue, because throughout the entire story, blue represents being in the United States. So a lot of people around Ave wear the color blue, but they never wear it. And again, like, you're not like, it's not written anywhere, it's not specific, but it's there. And as I was coloring it, I was discovering this about the story, because it adds to the layer of, this is about a Mexican kid who arrives in a new place, and they do not want to assimilate. They are still rejecting the idea of being in the US, because they want to go back to, they want to go back to Mexico because they miss their hometown. And I figured that coloring was a good way of adding to that storytelling. So yeah, those are some of the things. Those are some of the ways that I think about coloring as writing, that I think adds to the storytelling, that you can consider it too. Again, this is not a hard rule. It's just something to think about. Ryan, how do you go about both coloring and lettering?
Oh, you're mentioning mine's a little different, because as I showed you in my thumbnails, I do lettering very early on. It's the first thing I do. I want to know exactly where the letters are going to be on the page, so I know what to draw. And one of the selfish reasons is, I don't want to like draw a really cool tree in the background and it's going to be covered up, right? I don't want to spend all my time drawing a cool tree. Like in this panel, these guys are doing stacking rocks. It's a thing in Korea where you put a rock on top and make a wish. But these guys are very competitive, so they're making a whole mountain of rocks. And so I have to fit in a lot of dialogue and a lot of rocks. And so I do this because I want to know how much room I have for these rocks. But also when I look at the page, I might realize, oh, I have way too much dialogue on this page. It's going to kind of like, this is supposed to be a comedy scene. It's going to feel like you're reading. So, there might be things that I realize this could be half the length, or I don't need to say this. Like if you notice these two panels here, they originally had dialogue, but I realized that I can get across the same idea just by having him give him a dirty look as he puts his next rock. So that's really, for me, lettering changes a lot change the story a lot because you're realizing what you need, what you don't need. And then at the end of the book, I do the lettering all over again. I readjust it, and I kind of realize that, like, as I've gone through the book, maybe, this doesn't feel like the character wouldn't like to go into a monologue right now. Maybe they'd be more emotional. Maybe I need less lettering, and it's always changing. I can be changing a script until the moment I'm done because I keep altering the lettering. And then coloring, as you mentioned, that's a very important part of the process. So No Rules Tonight and Good Old Fashioned Korean Spirit, I was lucky enough to work with an amazing colorist named Amanda Lefrenay, which I do my own coloring, but for this book, I worked with her. And coloring can really change the feeling of a scene. So there's a scene in my book where two characters are stopped by a police officer at night. And I just kind of cut between the police officer talking and them reacting. Police officer talking and them reacting. And as I was working, it didn't really feel as scary as I wanted it to. But then when Amanda brought it back, colored, I realized that, she has the police cars lights are changing between red and blue. So in between panels, they're, first they're red and then they're blue and then they're red and then they're blue. And it really gives you a sense of emergency. That how your drawing can mean, you have very brightly lit scenes where it's daytime and they think they're positive. They think everything's going to be okay on this trip. It's not. Everything goes horribly wrong. And then as it gets darker and scarier, you can have pops of color, but things get dark and they feel moodier. Coloring is where you add the mood. It's showing emotion. You can kind of show what's going on in the character's head and their emotions by the colors you put on the page, whether they're dark, whether they're bright, whether there's a lot of contrast, whether they're very gray, whether there's no color at all. All of these things are affecting the story at every moment.
Yeah. And speaking of affecting the story in every moment, now let's go to the next stage where we have to show our work to our editors and our readers.
Yeah, so y'all are probably thinking like, so yeah, we made a book. We spent like 2 years making a book. We're done, right? The storytelling is done. We don't have to tell any more story. Well, guess what? You do, because the people who read your book, even, let's skip ahead. Even when you pick up a book, you're going to be changing the story because what's happening in the story, you're going to have your own interpretation. When you draw a book, the things that happen in between the panels, you are creating the story of what happens in between those panels in your head. Now, even before readers do it, there's something called an ARC. It's ARC. It stands for Advanced Reader Copy. And sometimes they're just ebooks, but sometimes they actually print. You'll notice this is a copy of my book, Good Old Fashioned Korean Spirit. That's not out yet, but this one exists. It's printed in black and white, even though it's in color. And it's basically toilet paper. You can see they print it very cheaply so they can just get it to people and so people can see it and give their feedback. And an example in this book where there was a scene where there's a kind of this, they invite someone into their band book club who's kind of a troublemaker, and he gets them into more trouble. And when the book was completely finished, we showed it to one of the people who was in the Hyunsuk's real band book club. And he said he loved the book, but that scene he kind of felt weird about because the protester who just wants to cause trouble was the stereotype that people had of people in this movement for the right to vote. And he said, is this book going to make people feel like that's what people were? And then he told me a true story of people that were hired to pretend to be protesters to join specifically to cause trouble and make the protesters look bad. So even though the book was done, I was able to add extra dialogue. There's a scene where someone's running down the stairs. This was originally a completely silent page. And because of the reader's feedback, I was able to put in dialogue where they're describing what they realized about the character at the very last second because of readers. And an editor is a reader that is hired by your publisher. Sometimes you can hire a freelance editor who their job is to give you kind of unbiased feedback about what your book needs. And they, through the entire process, at every step, they're giving you feedback. And a lot of people kind of complain about like, oh man, they're always want to change my stuff. But every single note I've gotten from editor has made the book better, even if I didn't take it. So as an example, when I was doing the original book band book club, this is a lot about Korean history. And there was a moment where we were almost done and the editor said, hey, I'm getting confused in this book sometimes because I don't know about Korean history. So you mentioned these things that I don't understand. Can you maybe go in and explain them more? Maybe in between chapters, put like a newspaper article about what's happening. And I'm like, I don't want to make people read a newspaper article in the middle of my book. So I said, what if I do the opposite and instead just take out all these little references you don't understand and make the book feel more timeless? Because people don't need to know exactly like what politician was doing what. They need to know how the politics affected their lives. What are the effects on their lives from what's going on? They don't need to know what policies and what people did it. And so, and then in doing so, not only did it resolve that editor's issue and make the book better, but people since then have talked about how they think that these books relate to what's going on in other countries. People have talked to me about saying like, oh, like when our book was republished in France or sorry, in Spain, people were like, oh, how were you able to comment so much on what's happening in Spain with your book? I'm like, I don't even know what's happening in Spain. I just wrote a book. And so you don't always need to take people's feedback exactly, but figure out why they're making it and what the issue is, and then let that help you tell the story you want to tell. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, like echoing a little bit of that. For me, the editor is kind of like it's your first turn. It's like the first bus stop to a fresh pair of eyes on your story. Your editor is the one who's basically in charge of making sure that you are telling the best version of the story that you want to tell. And if you have a good editor, shout out to Whitney Leopard, who's been my editor for a number of books, and a number of other editors that I've worked with. Thank you so much. Your editor is usually the one who is like looking at your story and making sure that it stays cohesive, that it stays true to like, to the point that you were trying to achieve, making sure that it stays consistent. And also following up, there's all sorts of editors. There's story editors, there's copy editors, and so on and so forth. And basically, they help you to make sure that your story just stays readable, cohesive, and on point. For instance, and again, like my big example for Halfway to Somewhere is that when I was telling the story to my editor, Whitney Leopard, she gave me this visual cue of like, you have a lot of this going on. I need you to like put it in. I need you to put it in order. And that was like the perfect feedback for me of like, I think I know exactly what you're talking about. Is that like I was trying to talk about so many different things that I needed to find a way to make it more to make sense from a narrative standpoint. And yeah, I mean, like, and then once the story it's complete and you get the editor like following up, it's like, yeah, then you get to show it to the reader, and the reader gets to give you their feedback, and the story gets to make sense to the reader, which is a really big step because the story just keeps on going that way. So yeah, I mean, this is just another step of like making a comic also includes who's going to read it, who is the audience, who is this comic for? And the answer can be just for myself. I just do this for myself. The answer can be is for everyone who never saw themselves on a comic before. The answer can be it's for people that have not seen a comic about their hometown. The answer can be anything else. It can be because you have a political message to give, or because it's just to entertain people. It can be a number of things. So I think considering your audience is important. So take that into consideration. I don't think it should dictate how you tell your story, but you should have it in the back of your mind as you're telling the story. For student practice, Use a moment from your day or week or month. Use it as an inspiration. Make sure it has a beginning, middle, and end. Sketch out the page of the story, and then, or your option two could be use a moment from your day and then switch it up. How do you wish it had turned out? Don't be afraid, and don't be afraid to change the gender either, or to change the genre. Just like experiment, try things out. So yeah, just the cool thing about comics is that you get to make them and you get to try things out. You get to see what works, you get to see what doesn't, and then you can just go from there and try it all again. Making comics takes a lot of steps. Every step adds to the storytelling. Again, I'm a big believer that drawing is writing, coloring is writing, but also the cliche that writing is rewriting. So make mistakes, try it again, show your work, because an initial idea becomes something else by the end process. And my most important advice that I like to tell everyone is just explore and find your process. See what works for you when you're making a comic. Be open to what others have to say to you, but also claim it as your own and figure out how you want to tell your story. Ryan, do you have anything to add in closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say that we've talked about a lot of steps. Again, some of them you do different ways, some of them you may not do, but every single one of these steps is an opportunity to like if there's something you're excited about, to figure out, oh, I have an idea on how to make this better. And now again, is if you're doing all these steps, it can be easy to be caught in the weeds, and that's why this having editors and readers is important, because like I had a thing literally just an hour ago where I was finishing a book and all of a sudden I realized, oh no, halfway through the book my sleeves changed from short to long, and I had to go through and do the entire book. So we're thinking so much about every detail, every line of dialogue, every line from a pen, every sleeve, every doorknob, that a reader can notice something, that a big picture that we didn't notice. An example that I had is when I was doing the cover for Good Old Fashioned Korean Spirit. I mentioned I structure like a horror story. So if you look at the cover ideas I had a lot of like scary cover ideas of different ways to show the horror of the book, and how I thought it should be. And then all it took was for my editors to look at it and be like, Ryan, your book's not scary though. It's structured like a horror movie, but they're disappearing because they love each other, because they need to communicate. And so then they gave the feedback that brought me into like, why don't you focus on the romance? And I tried to have like both something scary and something romantic. And then editors kept giving feedback until we finally settled on the idea that we had, which is focus on the romance and the grannies in the story that they kind of connect with. So we as creators have so many ideas in our head, and every step is a way to refine them and make it perfect. And just you also have to make sure that you don't like get too overloaded and like try to put too many ideas and too many overlapping things that make it more confusing. Just every step should be about making it more the thing you want to make and make you more happy with the process. So yeah, I hope that you all get the chance to make some art and share it with the world. I think now that we've said our closing thoughts, do you want to tell us about your books and your goodbyes?
Yeah, so once again, I just want to thank the Latinx Kids Books Festival for having us, and I want to thank the educators for coordinating and putting all the efforts, and I want to thank all the attendees. Thank you for being here. Once again, my name is Jose Pimienta. You can find some of my books at my website, josepimienta.com. Some of my books go are Suncatcher, Twin Cities, and Halfway to Somewhere is the most recent one. I have other books that I've been working on as well, such as Stars Hide Your Fire, The Leg, and Soupy Leaves Home, and Luminous Beings. Thank you for having us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
And again, I'm Ryan Estrada. You can find lots of stuff at ryanestrada.com, including thousands of pages of free comics, because I'm a terrible businessman. And you can just read those or go to your local library or bookstore. My middle grade book, if you're interested in that, those are Student Ambassador. And since we're in the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival, this is based on Zacatecas, Mexico, my grandfather's hometown, and it's a story about my experiences when I traveled there, but kind of filtered through an adventure story. My young adult books are all about fighting for the freedom to read. Check those out. It's all at ryanestrada.com. And I really think it's more important that you make your own comics and show them to us, because we want to read those when those are in bookstores. All right. Thank you all very much for watching. Go make some comics.